welcome to Aerotech's Automation1 Motion Control Platform Educational Series. Aerotech is a company that solves your toughest precision motion and automation challenges. Automation1 is a motion control platform consisting of software-based controls and development tools, PC and drive-based control hardware, and hardware-based drives for servo motors and other devices. In this video, we will take a guided tour of the Automation1 Configure workspace and take a brief look at access control, the integrated help, controller access and task parameters, the device catalog, and machine setup. My name is Chris Charlesworth, and I am the European Control Systems Engineer for Aerotech. As with many of our other training videos, I'm going to be using a virtual controller which is set up from the local host function within Automation1. You can find the instructions for how to do this and a tutorial on it in one of the previous videos. Now, starting at the Automation1 home screen, I'm just going to connect to my virtual demo system. Now, as always, this is all going to be done in real time, so if it takes a few seconds, please don't mind too much, but I want to give you a feel for how long different operations can take within Automation1. Now, the Configure workspace is set up with all of the different settings for our controllers. Rather than having to use a separate program configuration manager in previous Aerotech controllers, we've integrated this now with the other pieces of software. The Configure workspace is very important to the correct setup of a system. The best way to think about this is I need to make it do something or change a setting or anything along this sort of line will be in the Configure workspace. This also includes all of the tuning tools are accessed from here. The Develop workspace allows us to program, so we're writing our programs in here, we're developing how the system will run. And in the Visualize workspace, we are able to plot graphs of different types so that we can assess the performance of our system. Now, on the left-hand side, we have the main menu for many of the different options available to us. We have the controller section. Hopefully these names will be found to be intuitive to you. Some things are named a little differently to how they were in previous Aerotech controllers, but with a little time spent having a look through them to understand what each one means and what it does, I'm sure you'll acclimatise quickly. I'm going to go down this list one by one and just give a brief explanation of the functionality that can be found. So, starting in the controller section on the administration page, this allows us to configure our controller using a MCD file, a machine controller definition file. We can either upload them or download them. If we're downloading, we're effectively making a backup copy of our controller. If we are uploading, then we are possibly restoring a previous version of a controller, or in my case, I would be converting my system to emulate a customer system or a demo system. And I can also reset everything back to the default parameters. On the bottom half, you can also see where we handle the Automation1 licensing. At the bottom, you will also see another tab on here. Now, this is going to be common on many of the screens. You will see an extra set of buttons at the bottom. You can also access the access control functionality here. From here, using the Windows Active Directory, we can control who has access to this controller within an organization. And we can also set up whether they have admin rights or view rights on here. Let's take a quick look at this screen. So you can see here, I can put in my username and a password. And this is the username and password I use in Windows. It will validate. And then I will be able to configure this. Now, this is all configured for the Aerotech organization. In other organizations, it would be configured for them. Now, in this case, because I've had this configured before, I'm actually going to select yes. Now, you can see everybody at the England office can log into this. However, only Simon Smith can have administration rights. This helps us to prevent unauthorized access to the system. Now, the exact meanings of login and admin and any other permissions that are set up can be found within the Automation1 help file. Now, in this case, I'm not going to enable access control, so I'm going to cancel this. And I'll just confirm that that did not set up, and it did not. So, now we've gone through that, we'll move on. Calibration. Now, Automation1, like its predecessors, has a calibration function, and from this screen you can set up how that's used. You can look at the controller files currently stored on your installation of Automation1. As you can see, we have quite a few here, as this system is used for testing and demoing equipment. We can configure some basic parts of the data collection. We can set up and configure the infinite field of view. We can set how many different variables we want to have globally available within the controller, and we can also set our units. So if you wish to be on metric, you can also look at secondary unit names and things in here. There is the protection screen, which allows you to adjust some of the controller protection functionality. Motion health, which will be expanded in coming systems, but currently allows you to log different sorts of signal. And transformations can also be controlled from this area. As you can see, some screens don't have much information on them at the moment, but in future releases many of these will expand further. You can always access the help file for these things to find out more information. From the right hand side of the screen we can expand another set of boxes. Now, as mentioned in a previous webinar, you can access the controller to be able to disconnect from it. There's a notification screen. There's a quick navigation. Now, if you have an idea of what the page is called you're after, you can type in here and you can access it more quickly. There's the checklist functionality, and there's also access to the help file where we view this in a browser, and you can then search for the function you're interested in. Using the help function, as with previous Aerotech controllers, once the help page is open, if we click on a function, we then have the help page open immediately to inform you of the meanings of different options. I'd advise always having this open while looking at this initially so you become more familiar with the system. Moving on from the controller section, we'll move to the access section of the configure workspace. Now in here, this allows us to configure many of the special functions and generally control things to do with the individual axes of a controller. Now you can see here on the autofocus page we can set up what inputs we're using, the gains of the autofocus loop, any control thresholds we wish to use, and also the autofocus tracking. You can see I've selected the autofocus setup here, and immediately the help file on the side of our screen has updated to show us the information. As we move through, the drive settings can be accessed, so you can see options for the current loop, current offsets, and virtual drive. We can look at feedback tuning from here, so automatic encoder tuning is possible. Also manual encoder tuning from here. So setting up our analog encoders can be done quite easily and simply. We can set up and adjust gantry control with the gantry alignment functionality. We can set up how our system is homing on a per axis basis. If you've already noticed, towards the top left of each window there is an axis selection button, so we can page through and set each of them individually. It's worth highlighting at this point, if we look at our checklists, the checklist on a per axis basis is available, and you can see we need to configure the faults on X, configure the limits on X, configure the brake on X. Now, if I wanted to select one of these, I could actually jump to that specific function, and it will even highlight the area I need to pay attention to. This is helpful for being able to rapidly set up a system. So the aim is to be able to set up most systems within an hour on Automation1, and I think with experience and knowledge of how this system works, that fluency would allow you to do per axis in minutes rather than possibly 30 minutes an hour per axis on competitor controls. Moving back, we've discussed the homing functionality briefly. We also have the I/O setup, which is of critical importance for getting the best out of many of our controllers. We then have the motion page. We can look at the individual motor types that we're using and make modifications as needed. We have the optimization screen, which at the moment has the enhanced throughput module, the ETM function, and the enhanced tracking control available. I believe more functions will be added to this later. We have the axis protection, so limits, faults, inputs and outputs can all be set here and modified in different ways. We can talk about whether the brake has been set up correctly, or we can remap the brake output if we need to. We have the servo section of axes, where we can tune the individual axes and ensure they're set up correctly. We have the classical tuning available options, and we also have the frequency response. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, Aerotech prides itself on the quality of its tuning controls, and here you'll find things a little different to previous controllers, but you will find many of the same options and many of the same functions as previous. And in the future, these will be added to and expanded and made easier to use. And then finally on the axis, we also can set the units for each individual axis. So if we say it's in millimeters, we know it's 50,000 counts per millimeter in this case. Moving on to the tasks section, we can set up a joystick input. We can look at some motion task functionality, so the look ahead, the trajectory generation. We can look at some of our programming efforts as well. And there's also finally some task protection systems built in. I would advise you to familiarize yourselves with many of these different functions by just spending time reading through the help and maybe having a customer application handy to be able to do a real-world example. Now we're going to move on to device catalog and machine setup. We're going to start with the device catalog. Now, as with all of our previous controllers, we have motion libraries set up that allow you to add your own motors and stages to be able to be automatically configured within our system. The device catalog is actually being made easier to use and in many ways is being put front and center for us all. Now from here, this allows us to set up our own devices. So you can see if I open, you can see a BLM's ADC I set up earlier. You can see that this is referred to as an Automation1 device catalog. So for customers that have built their own stages or perhaps used a third-party motor, the system can be updated with these parts. Now we can put in a new catalog. Let's call this third-party motors. The description will be non-Aerotech motors. And we can also choose a location where to store this. In this case, we're just going to keep it in the Documents and Automation1 folder. But if you wanted to, if you had a shared drive of some description, you could refer it back to there. We'll save that and we'll create the catalog. So you can now see we have a third-party motor and we can start adding in our devices. So in this case, we're going to add in a new mechanical device. We can select from different options what type of device it is. As you can see, we have direct drive linear stages, screw drive linear stages, direct drive rotary stages, gear driven rotary stages, and rotary motors without a stage. If you wish to set up a linear motor from a different supplier, then you will need to set up a direct drive linear stage, as the stage would also be separate to our motor. In this case, we're going to go for a rotary motor without a stage. We're going to, device name of this case is third-party_1, and the description will be someone else's motor, and click Next. From this you can see we could copy and edit one of our own motors, or we could edit the specifications manually. Just for speed in this case, I'm going to choose a BM130. I'm going to just put in some basic options and then press on Next. You can see here immediately it's all populated. If we had chosen to do this manually, then you would add in all these pieces of information. Equally, if a Aerotech motor is being used but it is a non-standard winding, you would add it using the same function we have here. Personally, I would copy the specification for a motor we do have and then edit it. Now, I'm going to click on Next. We can tell what the feedback type is, so we could adjust it. Oh, in this case, it's the same motor, but we've put a sine wave encoder on the back. And then we create the device. Now, this device is available for use within the device catalog. And we then save to the catalog. Now we've set up our own motor, we will have a look at the machine setup system. So, machine setup is actually where you would start everything. Once you've set up the initial connection from Automation1 Studio into the Automation1 controller, you would most often come to machine setup first. Hence, at the top of the screen, you've been able to see the Go to Machine Setup box for quite a long time. Now, we're going to press Start. This is the machine setup wizard. This is being added to more and more. So as different functions become available, they're added to here. And I believe in the future, basic levels of tuning will also be accessed from here. This is the true power in the Automation1 controller and the increasing ease of use. You don't need to be a motion control expert with 3 PhDs and 20 years of experience to get high-spec motion moving. So, from the controller you can see Hyperwire is being configured, in this case virtually. We'll move on. We already know this is called Virtual Controller 1. We move on to the electrical devices, and you can see in my previous session we added in all this information. Now we're going to add an extra device, so clicking on Add Device, we can add in our device type. In this case, let's have an XC4E, 10 amp, 320 volt, with an expansion board and with the high spec multiplier, and click Add. You can see it's been added into our chain of options. Pressing Next opens up the mechanical devices. Now we're going to add another device. As in my previous video, this was set up with an AGS 1000. Here we're going to add an extra device. And so here we go, add a new mechanical device. And in this case, I'm going to deselect the device libraries, which can be selected here. So I can pick up my third-party motor. And in this case, we're going to put a multiplication factor of 30,000 on it. Click Add. We can open up a little tab to show our specifications. We could add in a serial number if we had one. And now we're going to click on Next. And this brings up the interconnectivity screen. This is where we pair our mechanical devices and our electrical devices. So I would hope to see for every electrical device there is a mechanical device. Or at the very least, for every mechanical device there's an electrical device, in case a system has been specified with extra drives for future expansions. Now, looking at the top bar here, we can see a set of ticks, and we can also see there is a no tick in this box. Now these ones have all been set up for the gantry, and this fourth one, you can see here, there's a mechanical device missing because there's nothing there, but you can see it's the XC4E channel 3, which is what we had on the previous page. And we can simply click and drag to put this in. It's given it automatically an axis name that we can change. So let's call it TP1. And we can change the units if we wish to. Let's put this in microradians just for fun. We could also invert the units of this. So if we had a motor mounted on a coordinate system where it may be moving opposite to the customer's coordinate system, we can invert it very easily here. You can see at the bottom we have 4 axes configured, and we can click on Next again. Now, as we've already set up the gantry, there are no modified parameters. With TP1, as it's now called, we can see that there are 22 parameters to change. If we wish to, we can click on View Changes, and we can see all of the changes that are taking place. So it may well be that everything's okay, and we've just gone, oh no, that's not quite right. The average current threshold can stay as 2.6. We could untick the box to allow that to happen. In this case, we're going to leave it ticked. And from there, we press Complete Machine Setup. Parameters are saved, the controller is reset, and the machine setup is now complete. At this point, we have to work through our checklist and ensure that everything has been ticked off. So if we open up TP1, if we were happy with all this, that would be fine. Now, and then we could run and home the axes. As you can see, this checklist is in a very logical order. We configure the faults, configure the limits, the brake, any thresholds that need setting up. We can configure different rates for the speeds, configure its homing, tune the encoder, and then run the easy tune to do a first setup of the servo gains and the filters. This means running through this on every single axis would allow the more casual user to achieve a good level of performance very quickly without necessarily needing the most specialist knowledge in the world. Now, that's it for the Configure Workspace for now. Hopefully this has been informative for you, and I hope you'll come back to watch the further sessions on the Develop Workspace and the Visualize Workspace. That concludes this motion control platform educational video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Automation1 Configure Workspace.